Dr. Hart is our next presenter. I'll allow Dr. Hart to open her talk.
Thank you very much. This is my first time in Buiatrics, so I'd like to thank the committee for inviting me to present my small study. I met with some great people and we'll be taking a few interesting tips and ideas back, so thank you for that. So on to my study. The title was The Investigation into Assessing the 4 Qs of Colostrum on 6 Commercial Dairy Farms. So I am just a practicing veterinarian in the southwest of the UK, and I predominantly now work with young stock, so probably about half of my time both doing sort of outbreak emergency calls, but also then the monitoring throughout a number of our dairies. So within the southwest of the UK is a mainly dairy area, and I think a lot of money and resources has been put into trying to educate the importance of colostrum to our farmers and the vets, but I still think about 3/4 of both the outbreak calls and the monitoring still seems to find that colostrum is a weakness in this part. So the objective of the study was to assess colostrum management and how it is actually being undertaken on the commercial dairy farms in my area. So we're going to assess the 4 Qs, because I think this is quite a standard way of which the farmers in the UK are being educated on how to think of the colostrum. So firstly, the quantity, so how much was being given. Quickly, when was that being given, so time after calving. Quality, what was the concentration of the colostrum like, and then fourthly, squeaky clean, so what was the bacterial loads of the colostrums that were hitting the calves. So the materials and methods, this was a sort of practical field study, so we were limited on what we could collect. So the volume and the estimated time between birth and calving, this was all collected by the farmer. Then the farmer was asked to collect a sample of the colostrum as it went into the calf. So this was either as it came through the esophageal feeder or nipple, depending on how they were feeding it. They then placed it in a sterile milk pot, fully labelled it and stored it between 4 and 8 degrees for a maximum of 48 hours. After this point, it was sent into the lab within our practice and we assessed it for the quality, so using an optical Brix refractometer. The same person used this in case there was a variation there. And we also cultured them for 24 hours to assess the colony forming unit, so CFUs per mil. This study was carried out in April to July of 2013, and we managed to get a total of 206 samples. So a quick race through some of the main results. So the quantity was the first Q we assessed. Here I'd like to make it clear that the farms did have, in theory, quite strict protocols of the 4 litres in 4 hours, which I think, even with a number of the talks this morning, seems to be the general protocols being put across. But it was still quite interesting to see that they knew they were being studied and having to record it, but still it ranged from 2 to 4 litres being given in that first feed. And the mean volume was 3.6. Assessing the number of samples, we had 57% actually achieving the 4 litres, and there was a slight farm-to-farm variation, but fairly consistent. This compared quite dramatically to the second Q, which was quickly. So here the mean time was 5.4 hours. Again, I want to make it clear that the farmers recorded this themselves. It was an estimated time of calving often, because very few were assisted calvings. And a few people were saying yesterday in field studies where farmers know that they're being recorded, often it is better than what they would be doing on other months. So it was still above the target there. And you can also quite clearly see on the graph that we had quite a clear difference between farms here. So farm 1 and 2 seemed to be hitting the 4-hour target. These were larger units. There were people on farm for 22 hours a day. And they did give a majority of the sample. So whether we got the 57%, because actually about 62% of the overall samples were from farm 1 and 2. Going on to the third Q, which was quality. Here, again, we measured it with the Brix refractometer. It ranged from 14 to 31%, which seems to, in my research, be quite an average range across the world. And here we got the mean score to be 23%. We had that 40% of the samples, so 82 of the whole 206 samples, were below the target of 22%. We did dig into this to see if cow parity had an effect, and it did, which backed up a lot of other papers, so on average heifers were poorer than cows. We also then looked at first milk recording data and also 305-day yield, and it wasn't significant, but unfortunately we didn't ask the farmers to record the volume of that first harvest of colostrum, which would have been interesting. Also then, sticking with the quality, we again tried to divide it to see if there was farm variation, which there was, but if you just look at the farm 6, it's quite clear that there's considerable within farm variation. So they were ranging from 15 all the way up to 31 with the interquartile range. And then on to the fourth Q, which was squeaky clean to the bacterial load. This is sort of one of the more recent additions to the Qs, particularly in the UK. So it was an area that I particularly was interested in. So here the target is less than 50,000 CFUs per mil. And so everyone has a sort of ballpark figure. It's said that any counts over 250,000 are often linked to fatal toxemias. So if we look, the average there was 130,000. We seem to get the target of the 50,000, which is within this column here. We had 17% of the samples were within the target range. However, it's quite a concern that we had 10% of the samples above that fatal toxemic possible level. So that is a concern. So what were the main conclusions of this small study? It was that at least 2/3, so 58%, received either adequate volume and within the adequate time frame. So this was on 6 dairy farms. They were commercial dairy farms, but they were selected because they were interested in young stock work, and also they were reliable in theory to collect the data. So whether it's actually worse in the true national herd, it would be interesting to know. The results on the quality were 40% were below this level, and it seemed to be more within farm variation. So some farms will say, well, we started to test it and they were fine, so we stopped. Well, actually, there seems to be quite a lot of between cow variation. And the third of my main conclusion was the bacterial loads were surprisingly high in a number of our samples. This study was done in sort of spring, summer of 2013. So whether that is a true reflection of all year round samples, we don't know. Finally then, the study does highlight the importance of on-farm monitoring of all areas of the colostrum management system. Very few of the farms were actually achieving the targets. And just to highlight again, these were farms that were interested in this area and did have, in theory, team discussed protocols, and everyone was on board. So it's worrying that could be worse in the true national herd. Just a few thank yous. It's nice to see that the room is full. So thank you for listening. I also like to thank the MSD Ruminant Bursary Fund for supporting the study. Paul Williams, the previous speaker, and also then David Barrett and Kristen from Bristol Vet School. My employers, so the George Vet Group, and of course the farmers involved.
Right, Dr. Hart's paper is open for questions.
Hi, Kat. Phil Elkins, practitioner from the UK. Thank you very much for presenting your interesting information. Were any of the farmers using any of the commercially available colostrum handling, pasteurisation, reheating equipment? And if they were, did that affect the results that you saw?
Yeah, so we did see on a number of the queues we were looking at, there was between farm variation. So farm one was quite a large unit. They were using no sort of commercially available things, just a set. They did store it, but because they had quite a high turnover, probably a maximum of 6 hours. Farm 2 was doing direct dam to daughter feeding, but again, being a larger unit, it was there were people on farm quite quickly. The one that was slightly different was farm 5. They froze all colostrum and defrosted it as required, so their storage was quite different, whereas the others were what I would call like the traditional UK system, so stored it in a sealed but unrefrigerated bucket for however long they needed it for.
Down here on the right.
Walter from Austria. Did you see an effect of the length of the dry period on the quality of the colostrum? Did you measure that?
We gathered that from the database where we found the 3 or 5 day yield. The data that was put in there, if it was reliable, there was no significant difference, but it was quite obvious that a lot of farms had just put in 42 days, so I don't think it was a reliable data set to be selecting from.
Jansen from the University of Calgary. When you started, you said you were just a veterinarian. Please cease and desist from doing that anymore.
Down the back, yeah.
Did you calculate, if you've got quantity and quality, how many calves actually got sufficient immunoglobulin if you did the multiplication rather than just volume and quantity and quality?
Yes, actually there was quite a significant crossover between the ones that achieved the quantity and the quickly. The ones that achieved the quantity and the quality was a bit more hit and miss. We tried to do, statistics aren't my strong point, and we tried to do further assessment, but we found that there was quite strong between farm variances on so many of the 4 Qs that kept sort of skewing the results. So unfortunately we didn't get any further on that.
Henderson from Brazil. My question is about, did you see any relationship between employees have just the health for care and between if for kids or not? If the employee need to do just the care with the health or need to do another things, have relationship with 4 keys?
Yeah, so within the study we also did a questionnaire on the farm to try and assess what risk factors were there. And the farms that were achieving the quicker times, so hitting the 4-hour targets, they were on farms where it was deemed that it was it was their job to do colostrum, so there was no set people. On some of the smaller units, some of them were sort of traditional family farms, and some of them were just smaller units still with employees. I think then it was just a time factor of who was on farm at that time. With the other things such as bacterial load, because it was just, we only measured the first colostrum feeding, so some of them fed colostrum a second time and some went straight on to powder. So I think that then the sort of stockmanship levels and the employees' sort of cleanliness would have come into it more at that point.
Nobody else? We have time for one last question, if there is one. I have a simple question. Did you follow through to the prevalence of FBT in the calves in these farms?
We did. We followed it through to weaning with the mortality, morbidity, and the total proteins we measured and Wisconsin scores. There was no clear which Q was important the most, but there was the overall, it seemed to be farm to farm variation. So the farm that was hitting the generally good quality the very quickly and hitting the quantities, then it was coming through. I think we had, from what I found, is the first sort of published work on the bacterial counts, they varied so hugely, which was partly a temperature because of that time of year. So whether that was affecting the results would have been really interesting to find out, but we didn't have enough power within the study.
Okay, excellent. Okay, we'll thank Dr. Hart again. Thank you.